Hello, everybody. I am Mike Mena once again, your tour guide of Foucault's History of Sexuality. This is part 6, I believe, of all of these videos, and it's going over the chapter entitled Periodization. So, the next chapter kind of brings the argument full circle, and Foucault offers a kind of condensed or mini genealogy. So it brings all the previous conversations together. So the talk about, teaching of children what sex is, and kind of making them scared of like dangerous things like masturbation. And there was also the medicalization of sex. There was the increasing focus on demographics and statistics. But before we delve into this, we need to understand what a Foucauldian genealogy entails. And to understand that, you gotta know what Foucauldian archaeology is, too. So the books that fall under relatively safely archaeology would be his books on madness, obviously the book entitled Archeology of Knowledge, and most definitely his book The Birth of the Clinic, which is also his most structuralist work. And a side note about this, anyone who tells you that Foucault is exclusively a post-structuralist is not correct. It's most accurate to say, maybe, that over time Foucault's late works were post-structuralist. Ultimately, Foucault has been both structuralist and post-structuralist. His archaeological works most closely resemble structuralism. I mean, he uses phrases like codes of knowledge, which is pulling from linguistic stuff and Saussure and the idea of codes and language. Now, what he was interested in something like Birth of the Clinic, he was looking at the structures that were sustaining practices and discourses in a certain way. His book, The Order of Things, with the subtitle Archeology of the Human Sciences. The original title was going to be The Archaeology of Structuralism. So there's that. So Foucault has been both structuralist and post-structuralist. Now, I'm going to give you a kind of visual to work with when it comes to thinking about Foucauldian archaeology. So, if you will, think of an archaeological dig, like, looking for dinosaur bones or pots or whatever that archaeologists go out and do, right? So they go and they find this site and they wipe out everything that's on the surface, right? So they're looking for this pot and they dig down, and they clear everything so that they can get to this pot, right? This is what you do when researching for example, discourse, that you have to clear away all the history and knowledges that have come after that point to get to the discourse that you want to research. And I'll give you a good example. So Nietzsche's work, or his concept of the Superman. So Nietzsche himself and his concept, the Superman, has been associated with Nazism, right? Now, we would not have thought of thinking about Nietzsche through the lens of Nazism if the Holocaust didn't happen. So when we're applying the idea of Nazism to Nietzsche, it's because we're thinking back through time, but also we're thinking of all of these things that happened through time to get to Nietzsche. But if you know anything about Nietzsche or history of Nietzsche, then you know that Nietzsche was already dead way before Hitler's rise. He also lost touch with his favorite sister because her husband was allegedly pretty racist or nationalist, or I guess what you might call a proto-Nazi, something like that. So archaeology isn't interested in going through the knowledge that we know back to reinterpret something that has happened, right? So it's not interested in applying modern historical categories to the past in order to reinterpret it. Now, genealogy is a completely different method. Now, keeping with that archaeological visual, right? So if we think of a archaeology site and we're looking at this pot or discourse or dinosaur bone, so an archaeological dig would have cleared everything off, cleared off all the discourses that are piled on top of it, right? What genealogy does is instead of clearing everything off, it leaves everything intact. And it kind of borrows a tunnel down to where it wants to go. And then it's telling the story while it's burrowing down, and then it puts all the dirt back in and comes back up. That would be what genealogy would look like visually, right? So there's an interest in preserving what has come after this certain point. Okay, now erase the tunnel idea from your mind. It's gone. We're not talking about the tunnel anymore. Okay? I'm going to give you something else to think about. Genealogy records the history of interpretations through time. So instead of attempting to interpret and reinterpret or search for something hidden that interpretations have missed, or looking for deep cultural knowledge, genealogy instead takes a very zoomed out view of knowledge and discourses. It stays close to the surface of discourses. Now, if we look at this book, for example, if you notice, it's extremely short. It's only about 150 pages. There's no deep bibliography in here. It's very surface level. Now, genealogy, furthermore, assumes no essential essences, but instead looks for strategies without strategists, looks for discourses without single authors. And finally, and perhaps the most important part of genealogy, is that there is a political motive to uncover what Foucault calls subjugated knowledges. Now, these are forms of knowledge that, for whatever reason, were disqualified from history and were buried underneath dominant narratives. This means that it's possible to uncover many genealogies. Now, Foucault's book, History of Sexuality, is in actuality just one genealogy. There can be many. There can be many genealogies of and about sexuality. But this particular book and the chapter Periodization is saying that the repressive hypothesis is exactly one of these dominant discourses that is more or less specific to the European elite classes. So, as I said earlier, there will be many possible forms of sexuality that may or may not have been subjugated to the repressive hypothesis discourse. So if you think Foucault is wrong about this, then he would probably say, good, perhaps that I am. You should create another genealogy. Because the last thing that Foucault would want to do is deploy another dominant narrative. So if we take anything from this book in regards to sexuality, it is his genealogical method. That is the important part. There is also the analytics of power, and then of course the last chapter, which we're going to get to in just a few moments. Not in this video, but in the next video. On page 122 through 123, we get an overview of what can be thought of as the subjugated discourse. Mainly that sexuality was deployed not as a process of censorship or limitation or repression, in which the ruling classes enforced this discourse onto a weaker population. Instead, we might think of all these technologies working together as a way of maximizing health and life, as a kind of self-affirmation. And the elite classes did this to themselves first, not to the classes underneath them. So, if you really think about it, who is actually going to visit Freud? Who actually had the money to invest in that sort of thing, right? It kind of makes sense. Okay, so this chapter didn't quite cover, or this video didn't quite cover very much of the chapter because we needed to focus on genealogy and archaeology. But nevertheless, if you know what is going on with the genealogical method, you will understand this chapter much better. You will understand the whole book much better. And you'll definitely understand the next chapter, which is by far one of Foucault's most famous chapters of all time. I've personally been assigned this chapter at least 3 or 4 different times in different classes. I had already read the chapter at least a couple times before I got there. So this chapter is very important. It'll keep coming up again and again and again. So you might as well really learn it. So I will see you guys in the next video.